Course in Miracles Original Edition, number 6 in the Lullabye course series. Chapter 3, Section 4, Miracles as Accurate Perception. We have repeatedly stated that the basic concepts referred to in this course are not matters of degree. Certain fundamental concepts cannot be meaningfully understood in terms of coexisting polarities. For instance, it's impossible to conceive of light and darkness, or everything and nothing, as joint possibilities. They are all true or false. No joint possibility. It is essential that you realize that behavior is erratic until a firm commitment to one or the other is made. A firm commitment to darkness or nothingness is impossible, because no one who has ever lived has not experienced light and some of everything. A firm commitment to darkness or nothingness is impossible, because no one has ever lived who has not experienced light and some of everything. This makes everyone really unable to deny truth totally. This makes everyone unable to deny truth totally. Everyone is really unable to deny truth totally, even if they generally deceive themselves in this connection. That is why those who live largely in darkness and emptiness never find any lasting solace. They don't find any lasting solace because innocence is not a partial attribute. Innocence is not a real defense until innocence is total. Your innocence doesn't protect you until your innocence is total. When your sanity is partial, your sanity is not a real defense until your sanity is total. And when your innocence or your right-mindedness is partial, when your innocence, when your guiltlessness is partial, when your guiltlessness is partial, your innocence or guiltlessness is characterized by the same erratic nature that holds for other two-edged defenses. The partly innocent, those that accept their guiltlessness partly, they are apt to be quite stupid at times. It's not until their guiltlessness becomes a genuine viewpoint, which is universal in application, that their innocence becomes wisdom. Innocent or true perception means that you never misperceive and always see truly. That's what true perception means. You always see truly and you never misperceive. More simply, True perception means that you never see what doesn't really exist. When you lack confidence in what someone will do, you are attesting to your belief that they are not in their right mind. Lacking confidence in what someone will do is hardly a miracle-based frame of reference. Lacking confidence in what someone will do, believing they're not in their right mind, is hardly a miracle-based frame of reference, but it also has the disastrous effect of denying the creative power of the miracle. True perception perceives everything as it is. And if nothing but the truth exists, and this is really a redundant statement because what is not true cannot exist. If nothing but the truth exists, then right-minded seeing cannot see anything but perfection. If nothing but the truth exists, then right-minded seeing cannot see anything but perfection or innocence. We have said many times that only what God creates or what man creates with the same will has any real existence. And what has real existence, what God creates, or what man creates with the same will, this then is all the innocent can see. The innocent don't suffer from distortions of the separated. The innocent don't suffer from the distortions of the separated ones. The right-minded don't suffer from the distortions of the separated ones. The right-minded don't suffer from the distortions of the separated ones. The innocent. The way to correct all such distortions, the distortions of the separated ones, the way to correct all such distortions is to withdraw your faith from them and invest your faith only in what is true. Withdraw your faith from the distortions and invest your faith only in what is true. Withdraw your faith from your ego and invest it only in what is true. You cannot validate the invalid. I would suggest that you voluntarily give up all such attempts because they can only be frantic. If you are willing to validate what is true in everything you see, you will make it true for you. Validate what is true in everything you see. Validate what is true in everything you perceive. if you are willing to validate what is true in everything you see, then you will make everything you see true to yourself, for you. You will make it true for you. Truth overcomes all error, which means that if you see truly, then you are canceling out misperceptions in yourself and in others simultaneously. And because you see them as they are, because you see others as they are, you offer others your own validation of their truth. This is the healing which the miracle actively fosters. I am willing to validate what is true in everything I see. I'm going to validate what's true in everything I see. And so I will make it true for me. This is how the truth will overcome all of my errors. I will validate what is true in everything I see. I would like to perceive truly, and therefore cancel out misperceptions in myself and in others simultaneously. And because I have seen them as they are, I offered them my own validation of their truth. And that's the healing. That's the healing that the miracle actively fosters. Perception versus knowledge. We have been emphasizing perception and have said very little about cognition as yet, because you are confused about the difference between perception and cognition. The reason we have dealt so little with cognition is because you must get your perceptions straightened out before you can know anything. To know is to be certain. Uncertainty means you don't know. Knowledge is power because it's certain. The power of knowledge is its certainty. Certainty is strength. Perception is merely temporary. Perception is an attribute of the space-time belief, and perception is therefore subject to fear or love. Misperceptions produce fear, and true perceptions produce love. Neither perception produces certainty, because all perception varies. That is why perception, or even true perception, is not knowledge. True perception is the basis for knowledge, but knowing is the affirmation of truth. Knowing is the affirmation of truth. Perception is the basis of it. All your difficulties ultimately stem from the fact that you don't recognize or know yourselves, each other, or God. All your difficulties ultimately stem from the fact that you don't recognize or know yourselves, each other, or God. To recognize different interpretations To recognize means to know again, implying that you knew before. You can see in many ways, because perception involves different interpretations, and this means that perception is not whole. You can see in many different ways. The miracle is a way of perceiving. But the miracle as a way of perceiving is not knowing. The miracle is a way of perceiving, not of knowing. The miracle is the right answer to a question, and you don't ask questions at all when you know. Questioning illusions is the first step in undoing illusions. The miracle, or the right answer, corrects the illusions. Since perceptions change, perception's dependence on time is obvious. Perceptions are subject to transitory states, and transitory states necessarily implies variability. How you perceive at any given time, determines what you do, and action must occur in time. Knowledge is timeless, because certainty is not questionable. You know when you have ceased to ask questions. You know when you have ceased to ask questions. But the questioning mind perceives itself in time. You will know when you cease to ask questions. But you have a questioning mind which perceives itself in time and therefore looks for future answers. The questioning mind, your questioning mind, perceives itself in time and therefore looks for future answers. The unquestioning mind is closed because the unquestioning mind believes the future and present will be the same, which establishes an unchanged state or stasis that the unquestioning mind feels safe in. This stasis state that the unquestioning mind maintains, this belief that the future and present will be the same, this stasis that the unquestioning mind is in, is usually an attempt to counteract an underlying fear that the future will be worse than the present. And this fear that the future will be worse than the present inhibits the tendency to question at all. Visions are the natural perceptions of the spiritual eye, but these visions are still corrections. The spiritual eye is symbolic and therefore not a device for knowing. The spiritual eye is, however, a means of right perception, which brings the mind into the proper domain, which brings perception into the proper domain of the miracle. Properly speaking, a vision of God is a miracle rather than a revelation. The fact that perception is involved at all removes the experience from the realm of knowledge. And that is why visions don't last. The Bible instructs you to, quote, know yourself or be certain. Certainty is always of God. When you love someone, you have perceived them as they are, and this makes it possible for you to know them. However, it's not until you recognize them that you can know them. While you ask questions about God, you are clearly implying that you don't know God. Because certainty doesn't require action. And when you say you are acting on the basis of knowledge, you are really confusing perception and cognition. Knowledge brings the mental strength for creative thinking, but not for right doing. Perception, miracles, and doing are closely related. Knowledge is the result of revelation, and knowledge induces only thought. Perception involves the body, even in its most spiritualized form. Knowledge comes from the altar within and is timeless because it is certain. To perceive the truth is not the same as knowing the truth. If you attack error in one another, you will hurt yourself. You cannot recognize each other when you attack. And that's because attack is always made on a stranger. You are making them a stranger by misperceiving them, by attacking them, so that you cannot know them. It's because you have made them a stranger that you are afraid of them. And if you will see them correctly as not a stranger, then you can know them. Right perception is necessary before God can communicate directly to his own altars, which he established in your minds. Right perception is necessary before God can communicate directly to his own altars in your minds. And from there in your minds, God can communicate his certainty and his knowledge. God will be able to communicate his certainty to your mind. And God's certainty, God's knowledge, will bring you peace without question. Peace without questions. Peace without question. God is not a stranger to his sons, his souls. And God's souls are not strangers to each other. Knowledge preceded both time and perception, and knowledge will ultimately replace perception and time. That is the real meaning of the biblical description of God as Alpha and Omega. the beginning and the end. It also explains the quotation, "Before Abraham was, I am." Perception can and must be stabilized, but knowledge is stable. Fear God and keep His commandments should read, know God and accept His certainty. There are no strangers in God's creation. To create as God created, you can create only what you know and accept as yours. To create as God created, you can create only what you know, which means accept as yours. God knows His souls with perfect certainty. That's because God created His souls by knowing them. God recognized His souls perfectly, and when God's souls don't recognize each other, they don't recognize God. Section 6, Conflicts and the Ego. The abilities that you now possess are only shadows of your real strength. Real strengths. All of your functions are equivocal, which means open to question or doubt. This is because you are not certain how you will use the abilities that you possess. All of your abilities are equivocal and open to question or doubt. And this is because you are not certain how you will use all of your abilities. And because you're not certain how you will use all of the abilities that you now possess, you are therefore incapable of knowledge because you are uncertain. You are uncertain about how to use your abilities, the abilities that you now possess, that are only shadows of your real strengths. And because of your uncertainty, you are also incapable of knowledge because you can perceive lovelessly. You are also incapable of knowledge because you can perceive lovelessly. You cannot create surely because your perception deceives. You cannot create surely because your perception deceives. You can perceive lovelessly. That's what keeps you incapable of knowledge. Perception did not exist until the separation had introduced degrees, aspects, and intervals. The soul has no levels, and all conflict arises from the concept of levels, degrees, aspects, intervals. Perception did not exist until the separation. Perception did not exist until the separation introduced degrees, aspects, and intervals. But the soul has no levels, and all conflict arises from the concept of levels. Only the levels of the Trinity are capable of unity. The levels which man created by the separation cannot but conflict. This is because the levels that man created are essentially meaningless to each other. Freud realized this perfectly, and that is why Freud conceived the different levels in his view of the psyche as forever irreconcilable. Because it is true that the levels that man introduced are meaningless to each other. And Freud realized that perfectly, and that's why he conceived the different levels in his view of the psyche as forever irreconcilable. The levels in the psyche, the different levels in the psyches, were conflict prone by definition, because those different levels in the mind wanted different things and obeyed different principles. In our picture of the psyche, there is an unconscious level which properly consists only of the miracle ability, which means it should be under my direction. There's an unconscious level that should be unconsciously under my direction. This miracle ability level in your mind. There is also a conscious level which perceives or is aware of impulses from both the unconscious and the superconscious. In our picture of the psyche, there's an unconscious level which properly consists only of the miracle ability and which should be under my direction. There's also a conscious level which perceives or is aware of impulses from both the unconscious and the superconscious. And so consciousness is thus the level of perception, but not of knowledge. Again, to perceive is not to know. Consciousness was the first split that man introduced into himself. Man became a perceiver rather than a creator in the true sense with consciousness. Consciousness is correctly identified as the domain of the ego. The ego is a man-made attempt to see yourself as you wished to be rather than you are, is the ego. And the domain of the ego is consciousness. And consciousness was the first split that we introduced into ourself, where we became a perceiver rather than a creator. The ego is a man-made attempt to perceive yourself as you wished to be, rather than you are. This is an example of the creator confusion that we spoke of before. Yet man can only know himself as he is. can only know yourself as you are, because that is all you can be sure of. Everything besides what you are is open to question. The ego is the questioning compartment in the post-separation psyche, which man created for himself. The ego is capable of asking valid questions, but not of perceiving valid answers, because these are cognitive and cannot be perceived. The endless speculation about the meaning of mind has led to considerable confusion because the mind is confused. The endless speculation about the meaning of the mind has led to considerable confusion because the mind is confused. Only one-mindedness is without confusion, and a separated or divided mind must be confused. A divided mind, a mind with a lot of different levels that are in conflict with each other, a divided mind is uncertain by definition. It's divided. A divided mind, unconscious, conscious, superconscious, ego, id. A divided mind has to be in conflict because a divided mind is out of accord with itself. There's different levels within it and opposing levels. Intrapersonal conflict arises from the same basis as interpersonal conflict. Intrapersonal conflict arises from the same basis as interpersonal conflict. One part of the psyche perceives another part of the psyche as on a different level and doesn't understand it, which makes the parts of the mind strangers to each other, meaning levels in the mind that don't recognize each other. Having your mind split into different levels that don't recognize each other and that want different things, having a split mind between these levels, this is the essence of the fear-prone condition in which attack is always possible. The fear-prone condition in which attack is always possible. You have every reason to feel afraid as you see yourself. This is why you cannot escape from fear until you know that you did not and could not create yourself. You cannot escape from fear until you know that you did not or could not create yourself. Because as you see yourself, you have every reason to be afraid. So your escape from what you're afraid of comes from knowing that you did not or could not create yourself. I am not my creator. I did not create myself. You can never make this misperception, meaning the way you see yourself, valid. And that's because your creation is beyond your own error. And that's why you must eventually choose to heal the separation. Right-mindedness is not to be confused with the knowing mind. Because right-mindedness is applicable only to right perception. You can be right-minded or wrong-minded, and even this is subject to degrees, a fact which clearly demonstrates a lack of association with knowledge. The term right-mindedness is properly used as the correction for wrong-mindedness. And the term right-mindedness applies to the state of mind which induces accurate perception. Right-mindedness is a state of mind which induces accurate perception. It is miraculous. Right-mindedness is miraculous because right-mindedness heals misperception. And this is indeed a miracle in view of the way of how you had been seeing yourself. Perception always involves some misuse of will, because perception involves the mind in areas of uncertainty. The mind is very active because the mind has will power. When the mind willed the separation, the mind willed to perceive. Until then, the mind willed only to know. After the mind willed the separation, the mind willed ambiguously. And the only way out of ambiguity is clear perception. The mind returns to its proper function only when the mind wills to know or to have certainty. And when your mind wants only to have certainty, not just my perception, this places the mind in the soul's service. I want to know with certainty, not just perceive with doubt or ambiguity. When that's what my mind wills, that places my mind in the soul's service, where perception is meaningless. The superconscious is the level of the mind which wills this. The mind chose to divide when the mind willed to create both its own levels and the ability to perceive. But the mind could not entirely separate itself from the soul because the mind is from the soul. And it's from the soul that the mind derives its whole power to create. So the mind cannot entirely separate itself from the soul. Even in miscreation, your mind is affirming its source, or your mind would merely cease to be. And that it merely ceased to seem to be. Even in miscreation, your mind is affirming your mind's source, or your mind would merely cease to be. And your mind ceasing to be is impossible because your mind is part of the soul which God created and which is therefore eternal. The ability to perceive made the body possible, because you must perceive something and with something. And this is why perception involves an exchange or translation, which knowledge doesn't need. The interpretive function of perception, actually a distorted form of creation. Interpretation is a distorted form of creation. But the interpretive function of perception then permitted man to interpret the body as himself, which, though depressing, was an attempt to escape from the conflict that man had induced by interpreting the body as himself. The superconscious, which knows, could not be reconciled with this loss of power, the body taking on a body. The superconscious, which knows, could not be reconciled with this loss of power in the body, because the superconscious is incapable of darkness. So the superconscious didn't go into a body. And that is why the superconscious became almost inaccessible to the mind and entirely inaccessible to the body. The superconscious. And after the mind induced the separation, the superconscious was then perceived as a threat, because light does abolish darkness, conflict, merely by establishing the fact that darkness isn't there. Light does abolish darkness merely by establishing the fact that darkness is not there. The truth will always overcome error in this sense. In this sense, the truth will always overcome error. Truth will always overcome error the way light abolishes darkness merely by establishing the fact that the darkness is not there. And this is not an active process of destruction at all. We have already emphasized that knowledge does not do anything. Knowledge can be perceived as an attacker, but knowledge cannot attack. What man perceives as the attack of truth, the attack of knowledge, is man's own vague recognition of the fact that it can always be remembered, never having been destroyed. The threat you perceive in truth, the threat you perceive in knowledge, is your own vague recognition of the fact that that knowledge and that truth can always be remembered, never having been destroyed. God and God's souls remain in surety and therefore know that no ego miscreation exists. That's what God and the souls God created know. Truth cannot deal with unwilling error because truth does not will to be blocked out. I was a man who remembered the soul and its knowledge, its certainty. And as a man, I did not attempt to counteract error with knowledge so much as to correct error from the bottom up. I demonstrated both the powerlessness of the body and the power of the mind. By uniting my will with that of my Creator, I naturally remembered the soul and its own real purpose. I cannot unite your will with God's for you, but I can erase all misperceptions from your mind if you will bring your mind under my guidance. Only your misperceptions stand in your way. Without your misperceptions, your choice is certain. Sane perception induces sane choosing. And the atonement was an act based on true perception. I cannot choose for you, but I can help you make your own right choice. I can't choose for you, but I can help you make. I can help you make your own right choice. And the atonement is the plan, the curriculum that helps you make your own right choice. The quote, "Many are called, but few are chosen," should read, "All are called, but few choose to listen. Therefore, they do not choose right." The so-called chosen ones are merely those who choose right sooner. Choosing right sooner This is the real meaning of the celestial speed up. Choosing right sooner. The chosen ones, the ones who choose right sooner. People choosing right sooner is the real meaning of the celestial speed up. Strong wills can do this now. They can choose now instead of even sooner. And you will find rest for your souls. Strong wills can do this now. And you will find rest for your souls. God knows you only in peace, and this is your reality. Section 7. The loss of certainty. We said before that the abilities which man possesses are only shadows of his real strength, and that the intrusion of the ability to perceive, which is inherently judgmental, was introduced only after the separation. No one has been sure of anything since the separation. You will also remember, however, that I made it clear that the resurrection was the means for the return to knowledge, which was accomplished by the union of my will with the Father's. We can now make a distinction which will greatly facilitate clarity in our subsequent statements. Since the separation, the words create and make have been greatly confused. When you make something, you make it out of a sense of lack or need. Anything that is made for a specific purpose, which means it has no true generalizability. When you make something to fill a perceived lack, which is obviously why you would want to make anything, you are tacitly implying that you believe in separation. Knowing, as we have frequently observed, does not lead to doing at all. The confusion between your own creation and what you create is so profound that it has become literally impossible for you to know anything. Knowledge is always stable, and it's quite evident that human beings are not always stable. Nevertheless, human beings are perfectly stable as God created them. In this sense, when people's behavior is unstable, then that person is disagreeing with God's idea of the creation. When my behavior is unstable, it means I have been disagreeing with God's idea of the creation. I can disagree with God's idea of the creation if I choose, but I would hardly want to if I were in my right mind. The problem that bothers you most is the fundamental question which man continually asks of himself, but which cannot properly be directed to himself at all. Man keeps asking himself, what am I? What am I? And man continually asking himself, what am I? Implies that the answer is not only one which man knows, but is also one which is up to man to supply. This question that man continually asks of himself, but which cannot properly be directed to himself at all, is what am I? And that man is continually asking this question of himself implies that the answer to this question is not only one which man knows, but is also one which is up to man to supply. Man cannot perceive himself correctly. Man has no image. The word image is always perception related and not a product of knowing. Images are symbolic and stand for something else. The current emphasis on, quote, changing your image merely recognizes the power of perception. But the idea, the emphasis on changing your image also implies that there's nothing certain to know. There's nothing to know. Knowing is not open to interpretation. It is possible to interpret meaning, but this interpretation of meaning is always open to error because this interpretation refers to the perception of meaning. The perception of meaning. Such wholly needless complexities are the result of man's attempt to regard himself as both separated and unseparated at the same time. It is impossible to undertake a confusion as fundamental as this without engaging in further confusion. Methodologically, man's mind has been very creative, but as always occurs when method and content are separated, man's mind has not been utilized for anything but an attempt to escape a fundamental and entirely inescapable impasse. This kind of thinking cannot result in a creative outcome, although it has resulted in considerable ingenuity. My mind has been very creative, but my mind has been only being utilized in an attempt to escape a fundamental and entirely escapable impasse, is what I have been utilizing my mind for, very creatively and methodologically. This kind of thinking, impasse thought thinking, impossible situation thinking, using my mind to take me into an impossible situation. This kind of thinking cannot result in a creative outcome, although it has resulted in considerable ingenuity. It is noteworthy, however, that this ingenuity has almost totally divorced you from knowledge. Knowledge does not require ingenuity. When we say the quote, "the truth shall set you free," unquote, we mean that all this kind of thinking, ingenious thinking, is a waste of time. You don't need to be ingenious and perceive when you could know, when you could accept knowledge, what's already so. But you are free of the need to engage in ingenious thinking if you are willing to let ingenious thinking go. And ask for knowledge. Prayer is a way of asking for something. Prayer is the medium of miracles. But the only meaningful prayer is for forgiveness, because those who have been forgiven have everything. Once forgiveness has been accepted, prayer in the usual sense becomes utterly meaningless. Essentially, a prayer for forgiveness is nothing more than a request that we may be able to recognize something we already have. Essentially, prayer a prayer for forgiveness essentially is nothing more than a request that we may be able to recognize something that we already have. In electing to perceive instead of to know, man placed himself in a position where he could resemble his Father only by miraculously perceiving. Man has lost the knowledge that man himself is a miracle. Miraculous creation was man's source and also his real function. God, the quote, "God created man in his own image and likeness," unquote, is correct in meaning, but the words are open to considerable misinterpretation. This misinterpretation of that sentence, though, is avoided if image is understood to mean thought and likeness is taken as of a like quality. In other words, God did create the soul in his own thought and of a quality like to his own. There is nothing else. Perception, on the other hand, is impossible without a belief in more and less. Perception at every level involves selectivity, and perception is incapable of organizing. Perception at every level involves selectivity, and is incapable of organization without it. Selectivity. In all types of perception, there is a continual process of accepting and rejecting, or organizing and reorganizing, of shifting and changing focus. Perception. And evaluation is an essential part of perception. Rejecting and accepting, evaluation is an essential part of perception, because judgments must be made for selection. What happens to perceptions if there are no judgments, and there is nothing but perfect equality? What happens to perceptions if there are no judgments, and then there's nothing but perfect equality? Well, perception becomes impossible. Truth can only be known. All of truth is equally true, and knowing any part of truth is to know all of truth. Only perception involves partial awareness. But knowledge transcends all the laws which govern perception, because partial knowledge is impossible. Knowledge is all one and has no separate parts. And you who are really one with knowledge need but know yourself, and your knowledge is complete. To know God's miracle is to know God. Forgiveness is the healing of the perception of separation. Forgiveness is the healing of the perception of separation. Correct perception of each other is necessary because our minds have willed to see ourselves as separate. Each soul knows God completely. And that's the miraculous power of the soul. The miraculous power of the soul is that each soul knows God completely. The fact that each soul has this power completely is a fact that is entirely alien to human thinking, in which if anyone has everything, there's nothing left, as human thinking sees it. And the fact that each soul has this power completely is a fact that is entirely alien to human thinking, in which if anyone has everything, there's nothing left. God's miracles are as total as His thoughts, because they are His thoughts. As long as perception lasts, prayer has a place. Since perception rests on lack, those who perceive have not totally accepted the correction of their ego, which means given themselves over to truth. Perception is a separated state, and a perceiver does need healing. Communion, not prayer, is the natural state of those who know God. God and God's miracles are inseparable. How beautiful indeed are the thoughts of God who live in His light. Your worth is beyond perception, because your worth is beyond doubt. So don't see yourself in different interpretations. Know yourself in the one light, where the miracle that is you is perfectly clear.